Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Heather Gudenkauf, and thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so excited to chat with you about my ninth thriller, The Overnight Guest, and to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind it, what went into writing the novel, and then to answer any questions that you might have about the book, about writing, about anything. I'm happy to answer those. And I'm coming to you today from my mom and dad's home in Wellman, Iowa. So I'm happy to be with you here tonight. I am an Iowa girl, grew up in Iowa. Most recently lived in Dubuque for many, many years, over 26 years, and recently moved to the Cedar Rapids area to be closer to family. And but I love the James Kennedy Library and John Kennedy Library and James Kennedy Library, sorry, and coming to visit. And so it's been a while since I've been in your library personally, but I'm hoping that will change in the future as things hopefully go back to normal a little bit more. So thank you again for being here. So yes, so The Overnight Guest. This book came out at the end of January, and it's been really exciting. It's hit the New York Times, USA Today bestseller list, Publishers Weekly's bestseller list. It's also been named an Apple Book of the Month, an Amazon Book of the Month. It was named a Barnes and Noble Thriller of the Month pick. And so it's just been a whole lot of fun to share this book with the world. So a little bit about it. There won't be any spoilers tonight, but a little bit about the book. It's the story of Wiley Lark. And Wiley Lark is a true crime author who travels from the Pacific Northwest to Iowa to work on a true crime book, to finish that book. And she actually comes to the fictional town in Iowa of Burden and kind of ensconces herself into the house where the crime took place 20 years before, the crime that she's writing about. And so she comes to Iowa, she's hunkered down, working on the book. And of course, because things can't go smoothly, a 100-year blizzard hits. And so she knows she is stranded in this farmhouse, and she can't get out. She has nowhere to go. She has a dog that's adopted her, and she just kind of figures she's in for the duration until the storm passes. Well, unexpectedly, she happens to open up her front door to let her dog out, and unexpectedly finds a young child laying in the snow, nearly frozen to death. And of course, she brings the child in, and that's when she quickly realizes they're not alone, that someone wants to get into the house and get to them, no matter the cost. And that story of Wiley and the child who she takes in, is that story is interwoven with the story of the actual true crime that had taken place 20 years before in that same house. So we meet the characters, the victims, the family. We meet the community members that were affected by this crime, and the police officers and investigators who are trying to solve this case. And so that's like a book. It's almost like a book within a book. So we have the story of Wiley, and then we have this true crime story that Wiley has written, interwoven through the book. And there is actually a third perspective in the novel that I call the mother-child thread. And I don't say a whole lot about it, but it is about a mother and her child, and they are in some pretty dire straits, a difficult situation, but it's really about their relationship, what they're experiencing, and how they find some hope in a really difficult situation. And so that's basically The Overnight Guest. The story takes place really within 24 hours. The Wiley thread of the snowstorm. So it's very fast paced. A lot of action happens very quickly, and we have to find out what happens to Wiley and the child in this house. And so that's the basics about the book. You know, I'm often asked, where do I get my ideas for my novels? And most of the time, almost always, I get the ideas from the news. And this really was no exception. And first of all, I think myself, like many, have been really fascinated and invested in all the true crime content that's been out there as of late, especially in regard to podcasts, and also, you know, the true crime documentaries, true crime books. I take that all in. It's something I'm really interested in, fascinated with. And I have a great admiration for nonfiction writers, but I am a fiction writer. And so I need to, you know, I focus on making things up, but I really did want to have a true crime writer be the main character in the book. And so that's how I created Wiley Lark. If I don't write true crime, well, then at least one of my characters can. And she does. She writes true crime for a living, and comes to Iowa to finish up her book about the crime that took place in Burden so many years ago. And so that's really where the idea for Wiley's thread came from. But also part of that, I was doing what many authors do, just kind of looking online for inspiration, looking through news articles for some kind of inspiration to spark for an idea for a book. And I came across a doozy of one, and it wasn't a true crime. It wasn't a crime, but it did happen. It was real. And it was, to me, terrifying and pretty incredible. And so what it was the story of a young woman. I believe she was from Minnesota, and this happened in 1980. She was she was from Wisconsin, I believe, and she was traveling to Minnesota to visit friends. And it was 22 below zero. The weather was terrible. She was driving at night. It was snowing, it was icy. And she's driving along, and the weather's getting worse and worse. And she slides off the road into a ditch and gets stuck. And she has to decide. She has to decide whether or not she's going to stay with the car and wait for help to come to her, or will she step from the safety of the car and try and walk the 2 miles to her friend's house in this rural area in Minnesota. Well, she decides to try and walk the 2 miles, and she almost makes it. She collapses just outside the front door of her friend's home, and isn't discovered for 6 hours. And in that time, she nearly freezes to death. She's discovered the next morning. Her eyes are frozen open. She's stiff as a board. They try to get her into the cab of a pickup truck, but they can't manipulate her limbs because she's so cold that she's just stiff. So they slide her into the back seat of the car and rush her to the hospital. And there, the doctors begin working furiously on her. They're trying to inject her with medication, but the needles keep breaking because her skin is so cold. But she survives. She survives and had no long-term effects. She was fine. But I read that story, and that terrified me. And so I knew I wanted to include it in some way in The Overnight Guest. And I did that with Wiley finding this young child out in the snow during this terrible blizzard. So that's really where the inspiration for The Overnight Guest came from. It took me about I started writing The Overnight Guest before the pandemic began, but really took off with it after the pandemic started. I think, like many of us, we were glued to the television. We were, so caught up in the news that finally I had to turn off the TV and just focus on my work. And so writing was a nice way to step away from the news, what was going on in the world and focus on this story. And it was really interesting. I was talking with two other thriller writers recently, and we all had books coming out at about the same time. Kara Ruda and Kimberly Bell and myself, we all had books come out this winter. And we got to talking about the subject matter of our books, and Kimberly's was books called My Darling Husband, and it's about a home invasion. And Kara Ruda's book is called Somebody's Home, and it's about somebody who kind of takes over this house, or part of this house, and won't leave. And Mine's the Overnight Guest, which is about a guest that arrives at this home. And so we just thought it was fascinating that we all wrote about home and how home is supposed to be the safest place in the world for people. But in these books, it became, the scariest place for them, all three of ours. And we wondered if that had to do with the pandemic, because, everybody was at home, and, that's where we felt everybody feels really safe during the pandemic and comfortable. And, with thriller writers, we're always trying to take people out of their comfort zone into something scary. And that was just an interesting conversation. And we just wondered, if that's going to change now that people are starting to feel more comfortable going outside the home and hopefully getting things back to normal again, if that will impact literature as we're going forward as well. So yeah, so for the book, did do some research. Of course, I always have to rely on my police procedural friends to be able to help me. So I have a former police chief from Dubuque, actually, who has always been really helpful in answering questions about the police procedural parts of my novel. And whenever I have a question, I can email him or call him, and he's happy to help out in that way. There were some medical things, of course, in the book having to do with frostbite and being out in the cold. And so I relied on my medical professional contacts to help me with that as well. But really, for this book, it was me and the characters in the book, and just working away, trying to put this story together and really get into the mind of this true crime writer who is so invested in chronicling the lives of other people and the crimes that affect their lives, that she isn't quite willing to look at her own life and the challenges that she faces. And then, of course, digging into the crime that had taken place within this small town of Burden 20 years before. And like all my books, they're set in Iowa, fictional town, Iowa. This one happens to be, like I mentioned, the town of Burden, which is made up, but you'll find it right around Sioux City, Algona, Western Iowa kind of area. And I always enjoy trying to, create these fictional places, but also incorporate characteristics of communities and towns that might be very familiar to you. And part of that, if you haven't read the book, and it's not spoiling anything, there is a reference to this tree in Burden. It's in the middle of nowhere, near these farms, this rural area, a tree that grows up out of the middle of an intersection where some gravel roads cross. And so this tree, 80 feet tall, has grown up out of the ground. So people traveling those roads have to slow down and go around the tree. But there really is a tree in Iowa, and I think it's more Western Iowa, where that is exactly what happened. This tree, I think over about 100 years ago, there's all kinds of myths about how it happened and why this tree grew up out of the middle of the road, but it's still there. People have to slow down to kind of maneuver through around it. But it was such a great landmark for this book because I do jump back and forth in time in the book, but into the different perspectives. So 20 years before and present day. And the tree kind of grounds you. You kind of get a sense of where you're at and what season you're in and what era you're in as well. So that was really fun to include that little real piece of Iowa in my fictional town. I would love to answer any questions that you might have about the overnight guest or other books or writing. So if you feel comfortable, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions, or you can put them in the chat and we'll be able to answer them that way as well. Any questions? Oh.
Hello, Heather. This is Ann McDonough, and congratulations on your tremendous success.
Thank you.
My question would be, now that you are again a best-selling author, do you have to do book tours? What's the life like of a successful author?
Well, I think we're still dealing with concerns with COVID, and so travel. So my publisher isn't really doing any travel for authors and not expecting that of authors. So I think, there's been a few in-person events here in Iowa. I've done that. I've gone to some bookstores in Iowa, done a few things locally in Cedar Rapids. I was in Dubuque. But for the most part, everything has been still online, like it has been for the last couple of years. And that has been such a great kind of happy medium because we haven't been able to, do these tours that we have in the past and travel to different locations physically, but we can travel, virtually. And so that's been a lot of fun. And getting a chance to talk with, readers that way, it's not the same as being in person and face to face with people. That's always best. But it's been a nice way where, you can, stay at home and people, who aren't comfortable being out and about can still connect with some authors that they really enjoy. And it's so funny, to think about it because right at the beginning of the pandemic, my previous book, This Is How I Lie, came out. And so everything was shut down. So there was no travel at all with that one and for anybody for that matter. And everybody was trying to figure out Zoom. Everybody was trying to figure out the online thing. And my first big Zoom event was with 3 other authors who were there to celebrate the release of these things hidden. There, maybe some of you were there, and it was through Zoom. And we all weren't very comfortable with Zoom, didn't really know the ins and outs. And we had some visitors who were not invited to the Zoom, were very disruptive and posting some very troubling content in the middle of our Zoom, and it was quite mortifying. But we've all learned so much, and now it's almost like second nature to be on these calls and these chats, and so much so that during the pandemic, I started this fun little author interview series called Sidekicks and Side Trips, where I interview authors and their pets. And so they'll bring their dog or their cat or their bird or whatever, and we'll talk about their pet. And then of course we talk about their newest release. And those have been a lot of fun. And recently I started with 2 other authors, Kimberly Bell and Kara Ruda, the Killer Author Club, which we interview specifically thriller writers. about writing thrillers. And so it's just become another form of connecting with readers. And, we try to make it as interactive as possible. Of course, it's still not the same as in person, but it's something. It's something. And you can find those episodes either on my website or on my social media of those fun talks with other authors. But yeah, so no big tours at this time. I think people are getting out and trying a little bit more. I did go to Arizona, but that was my choice, and did a few book events there. And that was really a lot of fun. So thanks for that question, Anne. Any other questions?
Hi, Heather. This is Jan from Bellevue, and I have a question about how you write.
Mhm.
And do you start with the end in mind, or do the characters just come to you in your head and then you start formulating what you want them to do, and when you get to the end, you're at the end? How do you do it?
Yeah. So for me, I always describe how I write. I write ugly. I do. I have a summary. I have an idea. So how it works for me is I'll come up with an idea, a short summary that I'll share with my publisher, my editor, and we agree that, this sounds like a good plan. This is the direction I'll go. And, but I don't outline. I don't have like a chapter by chapter summary. I think I know where the book's going to go, but 99% of the time it goes in absolutely a different direction. And so I say I write ugly. I get everything out on the page, see where the characters take me, where the story takes me. And then when I get that first draft done, that's when the really hard work for me begins, where I really dig in to make sure everything makes sense, that the characters act the way that they should, that the story flows the way it should. So for the overnight guest, I knew I wanted to write from three perspectives. I wanted to write from Wiley. I wanted Wiley, the true crime writer. I wanted her true crime book to be in the book. And I wanted to have this point of view of this from this mother-child point of view. But how it looked when I started writing and from when I finished it was really quite different. And, it took a lot of digging in, mining what I had for the good stuff and getting rid of the stuff that wasn't great. And in fact, that third perspective of the mother and child, I had bits of that throughout the book as I went. But it really didn't come together until like 2 weeks before my book was due. And I just reworked the whole thread of the mother and daughter. And it wasn't until I was almost done with the book that what I wanted them to say, or what I wanted that perspective to be, really came together for me. So it's really a journey, not only, it's a journey for me as a writer as well. So how it looked for me as I wrote this book, I started with the summer section, which was the crime that took place 20 years before, because when I started writing, it was summertime. And so that made sense. And I wrote for, got as far as I felt like I could with that perspective. And then I turned to Wiley's perspective, which is in the winter, and it just happened to be about wintertime. And this was a few winters ago, and it was a pretty brutal cold winter. So that was that was pretty, it worked in my favor to make sure I got the atmosphere just so. And then I just kind of threaded them all together and ended up with hopefully this cohesive, book where all the perspectives come together and make sense. But thank you. Yes. So I don't plot or plan, but somehow I find an end to the story. Any other questions?
Heather, there is a question in the chat. Sorry, I'm not in a conducive place to unmuting. Are you a work on one book at a time gal? Or do you work on, I gotta move it down. Or do
Yeah.
you have multiple irons in the fire, and are you working on something now?
Yeah, so I do only work on one book at a time. I am not good at multitasking books as I'm writing. I read like 3 or 4 books at a time, but I can't write more than one book at a time. So if I have an idea, I'll just tuck it away to come back to when I'm ready for a new project. I am working on my 10th thriller, almost finished with the first draft. Hopefully by the end of the weekend, I'll be done with the first draft of that. And it's been a lot of fun to write. It's untitled as of yet because I am terrible at titles. So right now it's just called Book 10. And it is a little different than what I've written in the past. I can't say too much about it, but I can say that while one of the characters is from Iowa and we start the book in Iowa, I'm stepping out of Iowa and going somewhere else because the story, the kind of story it is, I have to leave Iowa, which was really different for me as a writer because all my books have been squarely pretty much set in Iowa. So that was new, but kind of exciting and trying something new for me. But it will still be a thriller. It will still have a lot of twists and turns, and it's been a lot of fun to write. So I'm excited to share more with you about that when I can. So yeah, so talking of titles, because I'm terrible at them, The Overnight Guest was oh gosh, forever called Book 9 because like I said, I don't do well with titles. And then I had the idea of calling it Home Before Dark, but then there's this other great author named Alex Segura who actually had a book come out with that title. So I had to go back to the drawing board with that. So we just called it, my editor and I just called it The Snow Book for many, many months until she actually came up with the idea for The Overnight Guest as a title. And I thought that was just perfect for it.
Heather, this is Anne again. Do you write every day?
It depends on what part of the process I'm in. So for example, the book I'm working on now, Book 10, I didn't settle on an idea until I believe the end of May. And so when I was in that brainstorming phase, I didn't like start writing. I just looked for ideas. I spent a lot of time looking through news articles and, jotting down ideas and just kind of brainstorming. So yes, writing, but not composing, I guess. And then I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out the characters because they really guide the book for me. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about Wiley and what she's like and where she's from and her backstory and some of the other characters. And so I really get that straight in my mind. So again, that's more brainstorming. But when I'm in, when I start composing, actually getting words on paper that are part of the story, I do need to write every day, or I really try to. Of course, life sometimes gets in the way and that makes that hard sometimes. But for me, if I don't write or get something done or on the page every day, you kind of lose that thread and the momentum of the story. So some days I'll, the words will just seem to flow and, I can spend 6 hours or 8 hours writing and it's wonderful. And there's other days where it's like, banging your head against the wall and only get a few hundred words in and they're painful to pull out of yourself. And that's just part of the process. I've learned, I've been doing this long enough now that where you just kind of have to learn to go with it, but you have to get it done. You have to sit in your seat and, at least try and get something on the page. And so I'm at the point right now in the novel where I'm pretty much done with the first draft, but where I printed everything off and I'm reading through to make sure it's, the continuity's there. There's no big holes in the plot. And so part of the time right now is spent reading and, jotting notes down on the page. And then going back in, part of my days going back in and making those changes on the computer. So it's a little, it can be different every day or in each of the different parts of the process. Any more questions? Any more in the chat, Shirley? Let me see.
Nope, there was just that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess everybody's shy tonight. It's a small group.
Okay, no need to be shy.
So Heather, here in Dubuque in the community school district, we've discovered that a lot of our third graders are not reading at grade level. It's been a very, very steep decline. And it's concerning, of course. So I don't know if you can just address, I know you were an educator for many, many years, but reading and education and how you instill that in children. If you have any, I guess, perspective at this
Sure.
point in pinnacle of success.
Sure, yeah. So, for me, when I was very young, reading was really hard for me. And I was very delayed. And that happened to be due to a hearing loss that wasn't discovered until I was well into my first grade year. And, that it took me a while to get caught up, but they found that. But I think in my experience, and, as I was a classroom teacher for many, many years. I was a instructional coach for many years and our Title I reading coordinator for many years. One of the biggest indicators of success for children in reading is being read to, and being read to from a very young age. And that doesn't mean that, people are busy and, it doesn't mean like hours a night. It's just read every night, 10 minutes. The more you read, the better, of course. And, having kids have access to books and to literature of all kinds is huge as well. And another thing that's really important, and I know can be a challenge because of work schedules and, busyness of life, but if kids see other adults reading, that also tends to have a big impact on them as well. So access to books, being read to from a very young age, and, setting that time as sacred time every night, and which I do as, I'm the mom of 3. My kids are grown now, but I know how busy life is. And everything is competing for our time and energy, but that is really a gift that people can give their children, is, to read to them and to be a model of reading. And that can be reading a newspaper, it can be reading a magazine, whatever. And that can be very powerful as well. And I think, I could go into a lot more and, about how we are, funding schools and all that. But I think what practical things can be done is, in our homes early on, and, getting a good start for kids. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
Heather, this is Jan in Bellevue.
Hi.
I'm sure you've answered this question probably many different times, but What do you tell someone who enjoys writing? I certainly do. Mine is more work-related writing, but how do you encourage someone to consider doing story writing or becoming a book writer? And did
Yeah.
someone encourage you?
Yeah. I think, for me, I was always on the going to be a teacher path. That was something I'd always wanted to do since I was very young. And, but I love to read and I liked writing. I really enjoyed writing, but I never saw it as a career path for me. But there was something, that, it was something I was very interested in. And while I took, my college courses were for teaching and education, whenever I could take an elective, I took a creative writing class. And I did have some instructors who were very encouraging in the sense like, you're a good writer. And it wasn't like gushing. And I wasn't like this, prodigy publishing things at a young age. I mean, I just like to write. And those encouraging words meant a lot to me. It meant a lot. And I tucked that away until I felt like I was ready to really give it a try. And that wasn't until my kids were school age. I was married. I was living in Dubuque, teaching third grade. And it was just something I was really compelled to do. And I didn't know where it was going to go. I had no idea about the publishing world. But I really needed to tell this story. And it happened to end up being my first novel, The Way to Silence. And so my advice is what I tell people who are writers and, want to continue to do that or take it to a different level is write the book or the story or the poetry that you want to read. Make it your own and make sure, you want it to be fun. You have to enjoy it because you spend a year or so or more on a book or characters and a story. You really have to like them, or maybe not like them, but be invested in what happens to them and what's going on in this story. And you spend a lot of time with it. So you really do need to enjoy that. Other advice I have is not to give up. Publishing can move kind of slow and you have to be patient. And, but number one, I tell people you got to be a reader, you got to read to write, and you got to sit down and actually do the writing and make the time for it. And if it's important to you, you'll do that. And, the whole business side of it is its own, ins and outs of that. But, to be patient, not give up, and try to find somebody who loves your writing as much as you do. And you'll be on a good start, a good path.
Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Heather, there's another question in chat. What is your favorite of the books you have written, and what is your favorite book by another author?
Oh, goodness. So it's really, really hard to choose a favorite of my own books. I find that really hard to do because there's something special about each of them, or I wouldn't have spent as much time as I did on them. But there are some that are a little closer to my heart. I have to say The Way to Silence, my first book, is special just because it was my first book. And it was just me and this story that I really felt like I needed to tell. And, I knew nothing about the publishing world or life. And it was just me and the story. So that was really special. My novel, Not a Sound, is really special to me as well. It's the story of a woman who becomes profoundly deaf due to an accident, and the mystery that she gets caught up in with her service dog Stitch. That one is a really personal story to me, just because I do have experience with profound hearing loss, but I can hear. But it was a neat experience to be able to just explore the characters in the story. And I'd say, don't want to give away any spoilers about that book, but it really is my most personal book to date. And I kind of explained that in the author's note of the book. The Overnight Guest was, pretty special to me too, in the sense that, we, it was written during the pandemic, and, when there was so much uncertainty and, so much going on in the world, and it was a nice little respite to be able to, it's a dark and kind of scary book, but it was a nice way to kind of escape the real world and to get to know these characters who I really, really enjoyed writing about. But there's something special about each of my books that I could talk about. And then the other question was, do I have a favorite book? I have lots of favorite books, but my all-time favorite is My Antonia by Willa Cather. It's an oldie, I say, but a goodie. And so it's really about the turn of the century, about an immigrant girl who, comes to America, and her friendship with this young boy and how they grow up together. And it's really one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. And one thing about Willa Cather, she, writes about the Midwest at the turn of the century. She knew how to make the setting become a character in itself. And I always loved that. I love to read books where the setting, almost becomes a character on its own. And I attempt to do that with my books and bring Iowa to life for readers. But it's a go-to book of mine. I read it just about every year, or revisit parts of the book every year. Any other questions? I do have a few book recommendations for you if you would like any. A couple books, great books that I've been reading lately. One is called Beautiful Little Fools by Jillian Cantor. And it is this beautifully creative reimagining of The Great Gatsby, told from the point of view of the three women from the story. Loved it. There's a little bit of it has like everything I love in a book. It's historical fiction. It's got a mystery in it, and just this gorgeous writing. So that is one that is super good. Like a Sister by Kelly Garrett. And this one just came out. That was a fabulous mystery. It's fun. It's kind of sassy, but there's a really good twisty mystery in there as well. And I'm reading right now, I think it's called Reckless Girls by Rachel Hawkins, I believe. Really good. A lot of fun to read that one as well. So those are just a few. Like I said, I usually have 2 or 3 books going at a time that I'm reading, but those are a few that I've enjoyed as of late.
Do you have any final thoughts for us, Heather? I think it's been very interesting, at least to me, and I really appreciate that your willingness to visit with us virtually. It's a whole new world, isn't it?
It is a whole new world. It's not quite the same, but it's a way to connect with fellow book lovers. So no, just thank you so much for being here tonight. I love writing about Iowa. I love getting the chance to talk to libraries, especially. Always have held a really important place in my life, and librarians, and they're such special safe havens for people, and especially during these trying times. And so thank you, Shirley, and to the library and libraries everywhere for doing what you do, and giving me this opportunity to share my work with you and talk about the books. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be talking to you when your next book comes out.
Yes, and hopefully in person. So yes, so thank you everybody for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.